It was the kind of town where people felt safe leaving their doors unlocked and children could run freely in the yards without a second thought. The rhythm of life was calm and predictable, the kind of place where neighbors waved to each other. From porches and news of anything unusual spread quickly. But one day, that feeling of safety shattered forever. The story began with an emergency call, one that shook the calm morning silence. On the other end of the line, there was panic and confusion. A young child had been found unresponsive. The voice reporting the incident was frantic, yet certain details didn't align, something that caught the attention of the emergency operators immediately. Police rushed to the address within minutes, and what they found behind that front door would stay with them for the rest of their lives. The child was only 2 years old, far too young to understand danger, far too innocent to have done anything to deserve what had happened. The room where the child had been discovered was eerily quiet, a silence that felt heavy, as if the walls themselves knew the truth but could not speak it. Officers moved carefully, documenting every detail, because it was clear from the very beginning that this was not a simple case. Neighbors who stood outside whispered nervously, unsure of what was happening, but able to sense that something was very wrong. They saw the flashing lights of patrol cars, the arrival of paramedics, and the hurried movements of detectives who were already asking questions. The entire street seemed to hold its breath. Parents clutched their children closer, wondering if danger had somehow entered their safe community. Inside the home, things did not add up. What was being said by the adults did not match what was seen by investigators. Items were out of place, timelines did not make sense, and there was an uneasy feeling that someone wasn't telling the whole story. As officers carefully moved through the house, they noticed details that suggested more than just a tragic accident. The condition of the child, the disarray of the environment, and the tension between the adults all painted a darker picture. For the officers, this was more than just another case. They had seen many tragedies in their careers, but this one struck differently. The sheer innocence of a child, a life cut short before it could even begin, made the scene unbearable. Experienced detectives would later admit that they had to step outside just to collect themselves. Even the most seasoned professionals struggled to comprehend the depth of loss and betrayal this case represented. The first few hours after the discovery were critical. Investigators secured the home, began their interviews, and reached out to neighbors for anything they might have heard or seen. People recalled strange sounds late at night, arguments that sometimes carried through the thin walls, and moments when the child had not been seen outside for days. While no single observation seemed alarming on its own, together they formed a troubling pattern that investigators couldn't ignore. The news spread quickly, and by evening, the town was buzzing with speculation. Some people prayed it was just a tragic accident, others feared the worst, and many couldn't bring themselves to imagine the reality of what might have happened. For the family, the sudden spotlight was overwhelming. Some members broke down in visible grief, while others remained guarded and defensive. The contrast in behavior only deepened the suspicion of those watching closely. What haunted the officers the most was the thought of what this child's final hours had been like. Although they avoided discussing it openly at that point, they couldn't ignore the signs they had already witnessed. Something had happened in that home that no one wanted to admit, and the smallest details were beginning to reveal cracks in the story. At by nightfall, the house was taped off, evidence was being carefully collected, and detectives were already drafting theories. Though no one wanted to say it out loud yet, the grim truth was becoming unavoidable. This was not the result of fate or bad luck. Someone had played a direct role in ending the life of a child who should have been safe, protected, and loved for the community. This was the beginning of fear and heartbreak. For the police, it was the start of what many would later call the worst case they had ever seen. And for the little child at the center of it all, it was the end of a short life filled with silence, leaving behind only questions and sorrow that demanded answers. The investigation picked up speed the moment the initial reports were filed. Detectives had been in this position before, but the weight of this case was different. The very young age of the victim brought an urgency that could be felt in every step they took. They began by carefully revisiting the timeline of events provided by the adults inside the home. Statements were written down, cross-checked, and then examined again. But something was immediately clear. The stories did not line up. The details given by one person conflicted with the details provided by another. Even the simplest facts, such as what time the child had last been seen awake, shifted depending on who was speaking. The inconsistencies set off alarms. Detectives knew from experience that when truth is being hidden, the first cracks often appear in the form of small contradictions. Those contradictions were already piling up. To build a clearer picture, investigators turned to the people who lived closest to the family. They knocked on doors, speaking to neighbors who had lived beside the home for years. Many of them expressed shock and disbelief, but slowly, small observations began to emerge. Some mentioned hearing loud arguments late at night, the kind that made them uncomfortable but not enough to call authorities. Others said they rarely saw the child outside, even though most children in the area played on the street almost every day. One neighbor recalled hearing unusual noises on the night before the emergency call, but they dismissed it at the time, assuming it was nothing serious. Back at the station, detectives were building a timeline based not on what was said inside the home, but on what outsiders had observed. The gap between the two accounts was growing wider, and in that gap lay the truth. Investigators requested medical examinations, and when preliminary findings came back, the results were devastating. The evidence pointed toward deliberate harm. The child had not passed due to natural causes, and the signs of neglect were undeniable. To the investigators, it was no longer a question of whether a crime had occurred. It was a question of who was responsible and why. The community's unease grew as the news spread. People gathered in small groups, whispering about what they had heard, trying to piece together rumors into something that made sense. Some held on to the hope that it was all a misunderstanding, but the presence of detectives, forensic teams, and patrol cars parked outside the house for hours on end told a darker story. For parents in the neighborhood, it was especially unsettling. If something like this could happen just a few doors away, it meant that the safety they had believed in for so long was not guaranteed. Asterisk detectives went through the home again, this time with forensic experts at their side. Every object, every mark, every detail was carefully documented. They noticed signs of an environment that had been far from healthy. Rooms that looked neglected, items that appeared broken or left in unsafe conditions, and personal belongings that suggested tensions inside the household. Nothing was taken at face value. Every detail was photographed, bagged, and logged, because any one of them could hold the clue that unlocked the truth. Interviews continued, and with each session, detectives pressed harder. One of the adults began to falter under questioning. Small details slipped, answers changed slightly, and the confidence they had displayed earlier started to fade. Another person in the home remained silent and defensive, refusing to say much at all. To the investigators, the behavior itself was as telling as any physical evidence. Innocent people usually rushed to explain, to clarify, to make sure the truth was understood. Those holding back often had something to hide. The growing stack of evidence was beginning to form a story, one that detectives could not ignore. The contradictions in statements, the troubling findings from the medical team, and the observations of neighbors all pointed to one reality. This child's death had not been an accident. Someone in that household bore responsibility, and the weight of that truth pressed down on everyone involved in the case. Asterisk. The arrest brought a strange mix of emotions. On one hand, there was relief that justice was being served and the truth had finally surfaced. On the other hand, there was the heavy sorrow of knowing that no sentence, no trial, and no punishment could ever undo the loss. Parents in the community held their children tighter, grateful for their safety, yet haunted by the thought of how fragile that safety could be. Conversations at grocery stores, schools, and local gatherings were filled with the same stunned questions. How could this happen here? How could no one have seen it coming? As the suspect was taken into custody, detectives began preparing the case for court. They organized mountains of evidence, documented witness statements, and lined up experts ready to testify. They knew the trial would be long and emotionally charged, but they also knew their case was airtight. The pieces fit together too perfectly for any reasonable doubt to remain. What remained most painful for everyone involved was the final reconstruction of events. Based on evidence, interviews, and expert findings, investigators could now trace what had happened in the hours leading up to the child's death. Though they kept the descriptions as professional and clinical as possible, the reality of those moments weighed heavily on them. Even those who had seen countless tragedies admitted this case left them shaken in a way that few others had. By the time the arrest was publicly announced, the case had already been etched into the memories of those who worked on it. Officers knew they had brought the truth into the light, but they also knew this was not a case they would ever forget. It was not only about solving a crime. It was about the life of a 2-year-old who had been failed by the one person who should have offered protection. The finality of the arrest marked the beginning of the next chapter, the trial. But for the investigators, the sense of closure was incomplete. Justice would be carried out in court, yet the image of the small child and the haunting silence of that first day in the home would stay with them. It was the kind of case that never left you, no matter how many years passed, and for many of them, it would remain the worst case they had ever seen. The courtroom was filled with a silence so heavy that it seemed to press down on everyone present. People from the community, reporters, and even strangers who had followed the case gathered to see justice unfold. At the center of it all sat the accused, now stripped of the calm mask once worn during the early days of questioning. The trial was not just about evidence. It was about truth, accountability, and a search for closure in a tragedy that had left everyone shaken. Prosecutors began by carefully laying out the facts, starting from the very first emergency call. They showed the jury photographs, reports, and timelines, each one adding weight to the narrative they were building. Medical experts took the stand, explaining in clear, professional language what their examinations had revealed. For the jury, many of whom had children or grandchildren of their own, the testimony was painful to hear. Even though the court avoided graphic detail, the implications were devastating. It was impossible not to feel the sorrow of a life lost before it had a chance to truly begin. The defense tried to build a story of doubt, suggesting that the tragedy might have been an accident or the result of circumstances beyond the suspect's control. But with every claim came evidence to the contrary. Detectives presented their findings, showing how timelines conflicted, how lies had been told, and how the physical evidence pointed in only one direction. Forensic specialists explained their results with precision, leaving little room for interpretation. Each witness, each fact, each piece of data added another layer to the undeniable conclusion. This was not an accident. As the days passed, the emotional toll on everyone in the courtroom grew heavier. Jurors often looked down, unable to meet the eyes of the people speaking. Members of the community filled the benches, many of them unable to understand how someone they had once considered ordinary could be capable of something so unthinkable. Some openly wept during testimony, while others sat frozen in silence. Even seasoned reporters who had covered countless trials noted that this case felt different, heavier, almost unbearable. The most haunting moment came when prosecutors described the betrayal of trust. It was not just a crime, it was a violation of the most basic responsibility, the duty to protect a child. This point struck deeply with the jury and the public alike. The fact that the person responsible had been someone meant to safeguard the child's well-being made the crime more than an act of violence. It was a profound act of betrayal. When closing arguments arrived, the courtroom was tense with anticipation. The prosecution's words were measured but powerful, reminding the jury of the evidence, the inconsistencies, and the life that had been taken. They spoke not with theatrics, but with solemn conviction, asking for justice not only for the child, but for the community that had been scarred. The defense countered as best as they could, pointing to gaps and uncertainties, but their arguments struggled to stand against the mountain of evidence already presented. The jury deliberated for hours. That stretched into the night. People outside the courthouse waited anxiously, their whispers carrying through the halls. When the jury finally returned, the atmosphere was electric with expectation. One by one, the verdicts were read aloud, and the result was clear: guilty on all charges. The words echoed through the courtroom, bringing both a sense of relief and a wave of sorrow. Relief that justice had been delivered, sorrow that the justice came too late to save the life at the heart of the case. The judge delivered the sentence, ensuring that the accused would spend the rest of their life behind bars. For the officers who had worked tirelessly on the case, there was a measure of closure. They had fulfilled their duty, they had uncovered the truth, and they had brought justice. But even they admitted that this victory was bittersweet. No sentence, no ruling, and no courtroom outcome could undo the loss of a child's life. As the trial concluded, the town slowly began to heal, though scars remained. Parents became more vigilant, neighbors more aware, and conversations about child safety echoed long after the courthouse doors closed. Candlelight vigils were held in memory of the child, with families gathering to honor a life that had been far too short. Flowers and stuffed toys appeared outside the family home, silent reminders of innocence lost. For the investigators, the case left a lasting mark. They carried with them the memory of walking into that quiet house, the silence of the child's room, and the knowledge that they had confronted one of the most difficult cases of their careers. Some described it as a case that would stay with them for the rest of their lives, not just because of the crime itself, but because of what it revealed about trust, responsibility, and the fragility of innocence. The story ended with justice served, but not with peace. The absence of the child could never be filled, and the memory of the case lived on as both a warning and a reminder. For the police, for the community, and for anyone who had followed the trial, it remained the worst case of its kind they had ever witnessed, a tragedy that forever changed the way they viewed safety, responsibility, and the meaning of protection. In the forensic lab, evidence from the home was analyzed with painstaking care. Microscopic traces that most people would never notice became vital pieces of the puzzle. Fibers, residues, and objects left around the child's room all told silent stories. Experts examined them under magnification, running tests to determine their origins and timelines. Slowly, a timeline of neglect and harm began to form, and it was one that pointed squarely toward intentional actions rather than unfortunate accidents. Meanwhile, detectives returned to question the adults again, armed with this growing body of scientific evidence. Their approach was calm but firm, laying out details that contradicted earlier statements. The stress on the prime suspect began to show. What had once been confident explanations were now faltering answers, eyes avoiding contact, hands fidgeting nervously. The silence from the others in the house only made the behavior stand out more. It was becoming clear that the truth could not stay hidden forever. The most disturbing aspect of the case, as investigators realized, was that the child's suffering had not been a single moment of tragedy. The evidence suggested a pattern, a series of red flags stretching back weeks or even months. It was not just what had happened on the final night, but everything leading up to it that spoke volumes about the environment the child had lived in. To detectives, this was not only a murder investigation. It was a story of betrayal, of someone who should have been a protector becoming the source of danger. As evidence mounted, the suspect's history became a focal point. Interviews with distant relatives and acquaintances revealed more troubling patterns. Stories emerged of unpredictable behavior, tempers that flared easily, and an inability to manage stress. These accounts were not always taken seriously at the time, but now they became pieces of a tragic mosaic. The warning signs had been there for anyone willing to look closely enough. What made the case particularly haunting for investigators was imagining how much of it could have been prevented. The little details neighbors had mentioned, the records that had been quietly filed away, the concerns that had never been followed up, when pieced together, they all pointed toward an inevitable conclusion. Yet no one had acted in time. That thought weighed heavily on everyone working the case. The forensic evidence, the testimony of neighbors, and the inconsistencies in the suspect's own words all converged into a single undeniable truth. The child's death had not been a mystery accident or an unforeseeable event. It was the result of deliberate choices made by someone who had been trusted with their care. Detectives, hardened by years of experience, still found themselves shaken. As they looked over the case files, it was one thing to solve a crime. It was another to realize the victim was someone too young to even understand what was happening around them. By the time the third week of the investigation closed, detectives had more than enough to move forward. They could see the full picture now, and though it was painful, it was also clear. The final step would be confrontation, where the suspect would have to face the undeniable weight of the evidence collected. The truth was ready to come out, and the walls of lies that had been built so carefully were about to collapse under the pressure. Detectives knew the moment had come when they could no longer circle around the truth. For weeks, they had collected evidence, analyzed findings, and connected pieces that revealed the grim reality of what had happened inside the house. The suspect who had been at the center of their focus was called in once more for questioning. But this time, the investigators were not simply gathering information. They were confronting a person whose lies were unraveling. The atmosphere in the interrogation room was tense, every silence louder than words. What had started as confident denial soon turned into hesitation, and hesitation into fragmented statements that contradicted each other. The forensic evidence was now undeniable. Specialists had confirmed that the child's injuries were not consistent with an accident. Patterns of neglect were clear, and the timelines drawn from neighbors' observations, combined with the suspect's inconsistent stories, revealed gaps that could not be explained away. Detectives laid out photographs, reports, and documented findings in front of the suspect, each one cutting through the web of excuses that had been woven since the beginning. The suspect's face shifted from calmness to unease as the weight of the evidence pressed down. Behind the scenes, officers worked tirelessly to ensure no detail was missed. They revisited the house once again, searching for any overlooked trace. Hidden in corners, overlooked by the untrained eye, they found small but telling details that matched perfectly with the forensic timeline already built. These discoveries tightened the case further. At this point, there was no room left for coincidence. The truth was clear, and the suspect could feel it closing in. For the detectives, it was not just about proving guilt. It was about giving the child justice. Each officer involved carried a quiet determination. They had seen many crimes before, but the innocence of the victim in this case had left a mark on them all. Experienced investigators who had spent decades in the field described the sorrow of knowing that the person responsible had been someone meant to protect, not harm. That betrayal of trust was what made the case one of the most disturbing they had ever encountered. The turning point came when a critical piece of forensic evidence was revealed. It was a match that connected the suspect directly to the child's final moments. This was not circumstantial or based on suspicion. It was scientific proof, indisputable and clear. When confronted with this evidence, the suspect's composure began to crack completely. Words stumbled, excuses dissolved, and the silence that followed was more telling than anything that had been said before. The detectives watching knew they had reached the truth. News of an arrest spread quickly through the town. For weeks, the community had been living in fear and uncertainty, clinging to rumors and speculation. When officers arrived at the suspect's residence with handcuffs, neighbors watched in stunned silence. Many could not believe that someone who had lived among them, someone they greeted on the street, could have been capable of such a crime. The sense of betrayal extended beyond the walls of the home. It rippled through the entire neighborhood. Forensic specialists arrived at the home with their equipment, prepared to uncover truths that human eyes alone could not see. They moved with precision, scanning every corner, dusting surfaces, and collecting samples that could later tell a story in the lab. The smallest details were often the most powerful in cases like this, and nothing was overlooked. Patterns began to emerge that painted a haunting picture of what the child's life had been like in that house. The toys that should have brought joy were scattered and broken, covered in dust as if they had not been touched in weeks. The living space showed signs of neglect, with food left out, clothing thrown across the floor, and hazards everywhere. These were not the surroundings of a safe or nurturing home. As investigators pieced together these physical signs, they turned their attention to the individuals under suspicion. Each person in the household was scrutinized carefully, their histories pulled, their pasts dissected. Records began to reveal troubling facts that the community never knew. The adult who quickly rose to the center of the investigation had a documented history that included prior complaints from neighbors, instances of erratic behavior, and even minor encounters with law enforcement years earlier. None of it had seemed severe enough to spark major action at the time, but when combined with the present case, those incidents took on a new and chilling weight. The more detectives learned, the more it became clear that the tragedy did not come from nowhere. There had been warnings, but they had been scattered and ignored, never woven together into a single alarming narrative until now. That realization filled many officers with a quiet sense of guilt, even though the past could not be undone. They knew they had to push harder to make sure that the truth was fully revealed this time. As the evidence piled up, so did the tension in the town. People who once felt safe walking the streets now avoided passing by the house. Parents who once waved casually at each other now exchanged worried glances. What had happened was no longer just a family tragedy. It was a community scar. Everyone wanted to know who was responsible, and investigators were closer to answering that question than anyone realized. The stage was set for a breakthrough. The pieces were beginning to connect, and soon, the truth that had been hidden behind carefully constructed lies would come into the open. The case had shifted from confusion to clarity, and though the road ahead would be long, detectives knew they were closing in on the person behind the crime.